Hey everybody, and welcome to Social Point. I'm Seamus McGinnis, coming back at you after a couple of weeks off here. Things got pretty busy, but we are back with a great episode for you with Shawn Gude, who is a senior editor at Jacobin, and I would encourage everybody to check out his piece in Jacobin, Eugene Debs believed in socialism because he believed in democracy. That's a great overview of a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but it really lays out how a Debsian politics can connect to today and what makes him so important and such an important role model to anyone concerned with the needs of the working class and with any sort of left project today. And of course, Debs was Bernie Sanders' personal hero and is just very important to any sort of understanding of a left project today. So without further ado, here is Shawn Gude. So I'm joined today by Jacobin senior editor and longtime contributor, Shawn Gude. Shawn, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for coming on. I know that you're writing a biography about Eugene Debs, so we'll jump right into it there. Just sort of for people who haven't heard of him or who aren't aware, what's kind of just the basic overview of what Debs was able to do for the left in America and just what stands out as some highlights to you?
Yeah, so Debs was born in 1855. He lived until 1926. So his life was basically through the Gilded Age in the Progressive Era. And he grew up essentially with the rise of industrial capitalism in the US. So his life, some of his most able biographers have sort of shown his life through that lens. And so he comes out of, he's sort of rooted in American traditions in many ways. He believes deeply in kind of the general ideals of American democracy. But he also, I should step back, I guess. So he's born in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he gets involved. He works briefly on the railroad, and then he gets involved in trade union politics. He's a leader of one of the brotherhoods, one of the trade unions, edits one of their magazines, and he's a fairly moderate trade union leader in his early life. And then the kind of horrors, really, of industrial capitalism push him to the left gradually. And so by the mid 1890s, there's Debs is moving left, and one of the main reasons is because of the kind of sheer kind of class conflict and the kind of despotism of the workplace under industrial capitalism. And so one of the most pivotal moments is 1894 Pullman strike, and Debs the leader of that. It's a strike of the workers that build the luxury sleeping cars for the Pullman company outside of Chicago. And so that's, it's a really titanic strike in American history, and it also affects Debs quite profoundly. He ends up in jail. He sort of sees the what he has been seen, I guess, in more of an acute form, which is the way that capital has control over their workers and also how it controls the state. And so that pushes him towards kind of socialist politics that puts democracy really at the center, and pushes for democratization of the political sphere. So people can actually have ordinary citizens and workers can have control over the political process, and it's not dominated by business leaders and bosses. And also in the economic sphere, workers need to have control over their own destinies in the economic sphere as well. So Debs basically thinks that you need trade unions in the economic sphere. You need militant trade unions to go on strike if necessary, but basically just to unite as workers so they have power and they can push back against the bosses in the workplace. And then in the political sphere, workers need to unite and, in his view, needed to vote for the Socialist Party but basically you needed to unite as a class, both in the economic and political realms. So he carries that vision. Once he becomes a socialist, he carries that vision forward for the next few decades of his life until he dies in 1926. He's jailed. He's jailed during World War I for standing against the war as a socialist, as the entire Socialist Party in the U.S. did, unlike their European counterparts, actually. And so, yeah, that's the general, that's a very quick gloss in his life, but the general vision is one of I would say I would sort of sum up Debs's politics as the three tenets are democracy, internationalism, and class struggle. And class struggle is basically the kind of means by which you get more democracy, and you need to unite across the workplace lines, and you need to sorry, that's a train. You need to unite workers across workplaces and skill levels, and then you also have to unite workers across borders too, which is obviously even a more difficult task. But you sort of see Debs' internationalism most clearly during World War I, when he sort of speaks out against the war, and not just like as basically every Socialist Party leader was speaking out against the war, and the rank and file was certainly against the war. But I think Debs was alone in really like putting forward a really true internationalist vision in a way that not necessarily some of the other Socialist Party members and leaders had those commitments, but Debs like really put it at the forefront. So yeah, I think that's a general gloss of his life and ideology, and yeah.
So in terms of that kind of three component thing, in terms of combining class struggle and democracy, I know you've talked about sort of linking and sort of placing at odds the Debs 6 campaigns, I believe, for president, and then the Sanders campaign of 2020 and 2016 of being sort of majoritarian and then minoritarian. If you could kind of run down where you see the differences there, and then I guess in terms of that opposition, where's kind of the middle ground that we can learn from both to build out of it, in terms of maybe, not purely vote getting and not purely just trying to do class struggle without any popular policies by its side.
Yeah. So that was towards the end of that piece. I was trying to sort of make an intervention today, which I thought was necessary, because I spent a long time on this piece, and I wanted to provide like a general gloss in his life, and give people a sense of who he was and his politics. But I also, I was trying to think, what a Debsian politics look like today? And that was the kind of way that I was structuring it in my own mind after thinking about it for a while, which is what you just referenced, which was, I think, you don't necessarily have to pick Sanders. You could pick another figure, but I think Sanders today sort of embodies it pretty well. A kind of majoritarian style politics, and Debs, I was sort of arguing, was more of they're both in the democratic socialist tradition, but he's more of a minoritarian because he was quite willing to oppose popular majorities and actually put more of an emphasis on that, especially you see it in World War I. And he sort of, he was more inclined, although he had a mass movement, and he was never one to cut himself off from mass politics. He believed in mass politics, and he believed that the only way that things were really going to change is if like workers united on a really mass scale. But I think it's fair to say that he was more comfortable being a dissenter, I guess. And you see that during World War I, where the Socialist Party for a time was it was not an unpopular position initially, but especially once the U.S. got into the war in 1917, it was very, very unpopular. And then you see the repression against Socialist Party, both from vigilantes and from the state itself. And in that position, Debs was very comfortable standing firm and standing on the principle that he'd espoused for a long time. So that's one sort of tradition. And I guess you could also say Debs was not shy about pushing back against racism within the Socialist Party and just American society more broadly when it wasn't a popular position, obviously, because he saw it as central as to socialist politics. You can't have a socialist politics without anti-racist politics. So, and I think I might have mentioned a couple other things. He was also, I mean, this is probably the most unpopular position of all. I mean, he was a prison abolitionist in the 1920s. So, and he meant it, I mean, he probably meant it in the same general way that prison abolitionists mean it today too. But he'd sort of experienced prison up close, having been a prisoner himself twice. And so he saw it again as a kind of degrading, undemocratic institution. And so even if the majority was, at the very least, if the majority was the majority might not have been in favor of like deplorable prison conditions, but it was certainly not willing to entertain that sort of radical position that Debs was taking. I think Bernie represents a tradition of, again, trying to unite workers and workers at the ballot box and the workplace, and again the sort of centrality of class struggle to that. But the way that I put it in my piece, I think, was that he's much more comfortable, and he sees it as his role, I guess, to basically try to unite people around already popular positions that are sort of thwarted by the way that our political system works, and not necessarily like try to convince people of unpopular opinions or really stake out or make his name for staking out unpopular positions. And you definitely see this when it comes to like defunding the police, which Debs I think would take up pretty heartily, but I think Bernie, for understandable reasons, knows that it's not a majoritarian position, and that in his view it's more important to push things like Medicare for all and to some extent the Green New Deal, although less so. But Medicare for all, free college, you could put some other stuff in there too, but very clearly, taxing the rich, very clearly positions that are already held by the majority, and then trying to push through that kind of stuff. In terms of finding a middle ground, I think it's always a tension, and it's not an easy, you can't really point to, the way that when I'm thinking about it, I can sort of feel myself getting pulled back and forth in different directions.
Same here,
yeah. But I think it's not necessarily finding, I think in our head, we should be like, we need to find a middle ground, but also just being aware of that tension is very useful, I think. So we can like have it structured in our minds, the sort of internal conflicts that we might feel if we have these like general convictions. And that feeling of getting pulled in different directions. I think if we have that, at least for me, if we have that sort of framework in place, then we can better understand like what the competing impulses that we might have are, and like what might be the best strategy at a particular moment. But I think above all, it's just like important to have that tension in our minds, I guess, that it's a reality, and that it's like the way, I mean, I haven't really found a way out of it. So I think it's just an inescapable part of kind of democratic socialist politics if you're both committed to mass politics and also, have some positions that are quite out of, certainly once you get outside of, well, I don't know, that's not necessarily true, but you have an immediate agenda that in many ways is popular, but you also have some positions that aren't popular, and certainly in the medium to long term, you have positions that don't have majority support. So so I think just holding that tension in our heads is an important thing.
I do think it's almost kind of a conflict between Debs was taking a more long-term view. Of course, he didn't really have planned, he didn't really want to go sit in the Oval Office. It was more consciousness raising was the goal. And there's kind of an intersection point there where the Sanders campaign, I feel like personally, it was the thing that moved me left and was consciousness raising for me. So I think like the way that maybe a broader project, on the ground, if there's things to offer in terms of, all right, we're going to give you healthcare, but it doesn't stop there because it will get dismantled in the way that it did after Debs's passing, when we made progress, and then the past century has been sort of a reversal out of that. But he, in a lot of his writings, focuses on, especially talking about something that it's funny that people would call Bernie a radical when you look at someone like his hero Debs to be constantly calling for an end to wage labor, or an end to wage, even calls it wage slavery, which kind of goes to this overarching theme of freedom. And I think that cuts right into that kind of the idea that you can't have democracy without economic freedom, without a deeper level of freedom than, I guess, his battle was more against the way that, and it's become more entrenched since his time, of the way that a concept of negative freedoms, or sort of the way that libertarians approach the idea of freedom, is so baked into American culture, into the American psyche. I guess, where do you see his place in the battle against that conception of freedom and into something more positive, something more less of I want to be able to have gun duels in the streets, and more like they have in New Hampshire, that little ANCAP thing that they did there, and more of a I guess changing minds in terms of, rather than ceding the ground of freedom to people who would say socialism takes away your freedoms because of whatever libertarian non-aggression principle or something. I guess, what did he stand for, and what is the greater project here in terms of expanding that definition of freedom out of the grounds of purely negative, I guess, personal liberties?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think today it's very important on a rhetorical level, and just on ethical level too, but on a rhetorical level, I think it's really important for socialists to talk about the project as one of expanding freedom and democracy. In terms of Debs, it's hard because it was so long ago that the tradition that he was coming out of is I mean, I don't know. It certainly was this sort of stuff that Isaiah Berlin was talking about in negative and positive freedom. It was obviously around at the time, but it was a different context. But I guess I would say that Debs basically came out of a kind of smaller Republican tradition, and he was the kind of, Alex Urevich has written about this, and I'm trying to remember what his book is called now, but it's a fantastic book, and it's basically about labor republicanism after the Civil War, and the Knights of Labor, the first major kind of industrial union, their members and their leadership took up this kind of Republican tradition, which basically the core tenet is freedom is non-domination. So you're not you're not free if you you're not free if someone say a boss, you're not free if someone has arbitrary authority over you. So it doesn't matter necessarily if your boss doesn't, if your boss like retaliates against you or you know, does something even worse. I don't know. But if your boss violates your freedom, the problem is that your boss has that authority in the first place over you, and it's not necessarily even you. It's not a question of if you have a benevolent boss or not. The question is whether you have a boss. That's the core problem. So that was the sort of position that the Labor Republicans took, and it was something that they expanded basically to the entire economy. And they were like, if you have, you can't have in their eyes, and they use the term wage slavery too. You can't, if you have wage slavery, then you can't have a Republican form of government. You can't have freedom in the workplace, and you can't have a free society. So that was the tradition basically that Debs was espousing too. And he sort of melded it with, because it was a little later, the Knights of Labor basically collapsed in the 1880s. So Debs was like, you know, he was very much alive at the time and was a trade union leader at the time, but he hadn't moved towards socialist politics yet. And like European socialism hadn't filtered over to, I guess it sort of had, but it hadn't filtered over to the US in the same way. But by the time Debs became a socialist the following decade, he was very much basically merging those traditions. I mean, he was deeply American in many ways, and he was very much rooted in that kind of small R Republican tradition, the most sort of radical end of it, that saw freedom as non-domination. But he also was like pulling from the European socialists too. I mean, he read Marx, and he read Kautsky. Really, Kautsky was the big one, but he read various socialists, Marxists in Europe, and he sort of melded those traditions. And he also like threw in his own other American stuff. I mean, he wasn't a member of a church, but he was like a very religious man. Like when he was in jail, he put up the only picture he had up in the cell was a picture of Jesus. So he threw that into both rhetorically and just the way he thought about the world. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that he was certainly not the vision of freedom and stuff that he had. Freedom and democracy was very much at odds with kind of classical liberalism and kind of negative freedom. But I guess I guess one other thing I should add. I mean, I think in the best tradition of socialists, he didn't minimize the need for negative freedom too. I mean, he thought that it was really important that governments didn't have power to suppress free speech and to suppress civil liberties. Obviously, his negative liberty was certainly taken away when he was thrown in jail during World War I. But yeah, he was certainly part of a radical tradition that saw it as important not only to have negative freedom, but also say to have the power and the resources to be able to have a newspaper and start your own, be able to actually make the free speech meaningful. So that was he was he saw the limitations of negative freedom, and he was but he was also not one that would underplay the need for that stuff too.
I love your point about making free speech count, that you think about, I think, and I guess this is probably why some people would take issue with you brought up how he stood against, like, he was sort of in the more minority when it came to race, but he also, in his writing on it, pretty much said, like, if you give economic freedom, the race problem goes away. And I know some people have taken more issue with that fact, that I guess sort of uh, he didn't see it as there has to be reparations, say, but it more, I guess, like, once you grant total economic equality and freedom to all races, that problem just fades into the background, that it's more of a non-issue. I guess,
I think
in terms of
about that, but yeah.
What's up?
I think he was wrong about that.
Yeah, me too.
but yeah, that was his basic position. Yeah.
You did raise a point about labor, and I know he co-founded the Industrial Workers of the World in Chicago. In terms of, I guess, the way that he led the movement, his sort of just train rides that he would take on his campaigns and stuff, what role did labor play back then in granting everything from, just for people who maybe are less aware, like the 40-hour work week or ending child labor, like how much did labor drive the things that he was able to lead in terms of that movement? And then I guess sort of looking more at today, what does that tell us for the need for the ways that we could rebuild labor now? And I guess, is there a way even to build a left project without specifically like trade union or just labor union power?
Yeah. Well, on the last question, no, there's definitely not. Like I think if you just look historically, like if without, like on a theoretical level, you can say like that workers have all this untapped power, and if they sort of unite, they're both oppressed, but they have this untapped power, and if they unite, then they can bring society to a standstill. You could say that on a theoretical level, and it's totally true, but also just like looking empirically, like the only way that changes really come about is when there's a strong labor movement. And that's actually, I mean, it's even true for even other struggles that are, essential democratic struggles, are much stronger when they're rooted in the labor movement, whether it's a civil rights movement or the women's movement. Because if they don't, they both end up having less power, because a kind of strong labor movement is still like the strongest sort of social force that can push back against the kind of domination of corporate power. And also, if it doesn't do that, if it's not linked to labor, it's also ends up leaving lots and lots of people out. So it ends up, say, with the anti-racist movement, it ends up prioritizing, say, like middle and upper middle classes of that particular segment of society. Same with the feminist movement. So if it's not actually rooted in the working class, then you have basically a kind of liberal anti-racist project that is, can deliver some good stuff, but doesn't change a lot. It doesn't really fundamentally change a lot of people's lives. Like, a Black worker certainly has it better off than they did several decades ago, but because I guess, you can call it a variety of things, but basically because the kind of push after the kind of legalistic gains of the civil rights movement failed, and say the poor people's movement that Martin Luther King was pushing, and other Black activists were pushing for, economic rights that would really change the balance of power in society and help Black workers and other workers as well. Because that failed, we have the society that we have today. And, I live in Chicago, very segregated city. And basically the Chicago we have today, you can point to other cities too, but the Chicago we have today is the way it is because of the failure of that stuff. And, Black workers are better off in some ways than they were a few decades ago, absolutely. But the centrality of labor kind of speaks to that, because if we were able to win that battle, then Chicago and other cities like it would have been transformed, and not just people in the Black middle class, but Black workers. The vast majority of Black people in the U.S. would be much better off. So yeah. And then I guess going back, I think labor was central during Debs's time, although there were some really, really pitched battles. I think people don't necessarily know how bloody of a labor history the United States has. I mean, it has the bloodiest labor history of any advanced capitalist country. And lots and lots and lots of workers killed during strikes. And really, I mean, this kind of goes back to what horrified Debs, just like workers or employers having just enormous control over their workplaces, and just basic kind of the things that we would think about in the political sphere or social sphere as, like, say, civil liberties and stuff, the right to free speech and the right to due process or something. None of that is sort of recognized in the workplace, and it's certainly strides have been made today, but to the extent that we have that stuff, it's because of labor unions. So I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but yeah, it's rebuilding the labor movement is the central task of the left.
No, that's totally. I mean, even I grew up in Chicago, so I feel a little bit of city pride there with everything from, you brought up like the bloody history, everything from May Day to the Ludlow massacre in Colorado with the coal workers, and you see just National Guard being sent in and just gunning down women and children and stuff like that you have just such an aggressive history that whether on our soil or internationally, to go kind of lastly to that internationalist tenet. I guess what drove Debs's internationalist sort of rhetoric? I know he stood a lot by, of course, Workers of the World Unite and Marx and everything, but what drove kind of his internationalist approach? And then in terms of America has just been so staunchly and I guess militantly capitalist to stop any domestic thing, like with the bloodiness of labor history, and then anti-communist abroad, campaigns abroad that have interfered, especially in the global South. I guess what would a Debsian approach to internationalism look like in terms of what we could do in terms of a project to reverse some of that and I guess to combat the history of how that's gone?
Yeah, that's a big question. On the first part, it's hard to know exactly what motivated Debs. I think he was an egalitarian to his bones, and just a small d Democrat to his bones. So I think just the idea of other people outside the US, like, he didn't draw distinctions between a citizen or a worker in the US and someone elsewhere. So the idea that, like, they should be treated differently, or they should that, say, the US should be able to intervene and and treat others elsewhere as like subordinates would have appalled him. So I think on that level, just like an ethical commitment. And then I think also probably once he did become a socialist, he was sort of put into this sort of environment where European socialists were the strongest socialist parties at the time, and they certainly had their failings, but they at the very least they did talk about the importance of uniting the working class across borders. So I think it was probably a combination of those two. He was sort of like primed to like accept that and promulgate that message. And then there was also just people in his sphere that were pushing that message as well. So once he became a socialist, in terms of what that looks like today, I mean, it's hard to say beyond a broad, like the general vision is very hard, or it's very easy to sketch out. It's like much harder to think about how actually to win that sort of thing. And I think like people like Daniel Bessner and some other people are thinking more about like a foreign policy for the left. And I think that's really, really crucial because, there has been, we could use more of this thinking everywhere in every sphere, whether it's the economic sphere or the household, or what types of policies and arrangements and structures we could actually sort of use to instantiate kind of socialist values. But I think foreign policy is one that's really been kind of neglected. And other than, I think actually I'm cribbing from Daniel Bessner again here, but like, I think he was saying the other day something like, for a long time, like the left's platform has basically just been like, US out of, so-and-so, like US needs to get out of Iraq, US needs to get out of blah, blah, blah. And obviously, yeah, like, we need to stop fighting aggressive wars that are killing people and in the U.S. and harming people, troops that come back as well, and killing people abroad. We need to end that stuff, but we need something more than that. Like we need a broader vision than that.
Because I know he was talking, I think it was with Derek Davison with foreign exchanges.
Yeah.
They were talking about, the idea that foreign policy, it's like, okay, let's get out of Iraq or something, but then the struggle is the question of something like Rwanda. What do you do when you do want to get involved, when intervention does seem kind of intuitive? Can you dismantle empire while still, where do you draw that line in terms of, do we stop genocide when we see it? And then does that open that door for empire anyway? And yeah. I think that raises a lot of hard conflicts that I'm know too little about foreign policy, but I think that's such an important thing to approach in terms of, righting some of the wrongs that at least getting our boot off the neck of any country that wants to have its own project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at the very least, and that's something that, like, even if Sanders was elected, he could have done. Just the kind of first do no harm principle you could put into place very quickly, and just closing down military bases and just pulling troops out of a lot of places. I think so I guess I should say, like, the general vision is just one that the general vision is one of workers across countries. Well, I guess I'm trying to think how Debs put it. I think Debs says something like, we need a cooperative commonwealth, but we also need an international commonwealth. I think he basically thought that you just need democracy across countries too. So you don't. The idea of like a global hegemon is like anathema to him. That's not something that it's like obviously undemocratic, and so yeah, like for him, it'd just be kind of equality across countries. And then, but in terms of like the US, like I think I might have mentioned a few things in that piece. I think the US needs to like, the US needs to transfer lots and lots of resources and technology to the global South, especially around climate change stuff, but also just around general development. I mean, the South, the global South doesn't have to industrialize in the brutal way that that the US and other countries did. The Soviet Union did as well, in a very obviously shorter time period, but basically just compressed all of the brutality of industrialization into, you know, a decade or two. But the global South doesn't need to do that. That's not like a technical necessity. But obviously the kind of balance of power would need to change in society or in the world. So the sort of objective of international relations isn't to like subordinate other countries in the way that it is today, and instead like start to you know, assist other countries to bring them up to a level of development that they are not today. So I think that's important. That plus just like, yeah, getting the boot off of people's necks, because giving people more room to like actually fight their own governments, if they're like living in, you know, if there's an authoritarian government, it's much better for people to fight their own battles, and for, you know, people on the left here to offer solidarity abroad, but not to look to the kind of Leviathan of the US government to like deliver democracy, because that's obviously the track record of that is terrible. And it's just, yeah, it's not going to be the way to the US like Defense Department and the State Department are not going to create a more democratic world.
All right, that just about does it for today's episode of Social Point. I'd like to thank Shawn again so much for coming on. It was so kind of him to take the time to do that interview. I would encourage everybody to check him out on Twitter at Shawn Gude, Shawn with a W, Gude, and find me on Twitter and Instagram at Social Point Pod. We're a week out from the election now, a little bit more, but if you haven't voted yet, go vote. Hold on, hang in there, we're almost done. You know, just a couple more days and we're out of this. So, well, not out of it, but a new fight starts, hopefully. So please take care of yourselves, everybody. If you get a chance, take a break, take a breath. I know things are running high right now. I think everyone's kind of wearing down. So just, if you get a chance to go offline and step back and just take a break, take a breath, that's really important right now. So I hope everybody's taking care of themselves. Everybody stay well out there. And I will see you guys next week.